All right, we're recording. Show screen. And we're on.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. Today's webinar on NIST Cybersecurity Requirements for Government Contractors. Today we're joined by Rick Tracy, Chief Security Officer of Telos Corporation, and Rich Wilkinson, Director of Solutions Engineering here at Unanet. And we're going to start with Rick. He's going to give us a little bit of an overview about Telos. Rick, on to you.
Yes, hi, my name is Rick Tracy, Chief Security Officer for Telos Corporation. Telos is a cybersecurity company. We specialize in areas of cyber risk management, identity management, and secure communications. For the purpose of today's call, the cybersecurity risk management is particularly relevant. We have a strong pedigree there spanning over the past 20 years. I'd also like to point out that we are a recent Cogswell Award winner, just to underscore our focus, our intense focus on security.
And this is Rich Wilkinson. I'm with Unanet. Unanet is a provider of accounting and project management solutions for government contractors, all the way from budgeting, planning, and forecasting through time tracking, analytics, billing and revenue recognition, and full financials designed specifically for the government contractor and other project-oriented businesses. They say these webinars are a little bit like a trip to the dentist. They're a whole lot easier to take if you know exactly what's going to happen and exactly when it'll be over. So here's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk just a little bit, and I promise it'll be brief, about how we got where we are with this whole cyber mess. We're going to talk about the basics of the FAR and DFARS clauses, and then I'm going to turn it over to Rick. And I want to say a big thank you to Telos today for doing the heavy lifting on the technical requirements of this entire FAR, DFARS, and NIST standard. And then when he's done, and that may take a little while, I'll come back and talk to you a little bit about the business aspects of this thing, what you really have to do, what it's going to do to you, and how it's going to affect your relationships between primes and subs. We'll talk about exemptions, and if we have time, and I hope we will, we'll take a few questions. The problem with data breaches is what we see is probably kind of like an iceberg. It's probably only the tip of what's really going on out there. It's pretty scary, actually. The government first got involved back in 2010. They established a program that required controls over classified information, and for the first time, they introduced a concept of something called CUI, Controlled Unclassified Information. And this is information that is not classified by the government with one of the classification markings, but it's still controlled information, and it's subject to what the intelligence guys call synthesis. If you have enough of this controlled unclassified information, you can take a lot of data points. It's like a big data exercise, and you can form a picture of what the government's doing and when and where and how much. And that's information the government would really rather that foreign states didn't have. Eventually, this government action gave rise to the FAR clause, and we'll talk a little bit more about FAR and the DFARS clauses and how they're different in a few minutes. In 2013, Congress got involved. They issued they wrote a provision into the National Defense Authorization Act requiring DoD to establish criteria for what networks were to be considered covered, and to institute a requirement for reporting of data breaches. They gave DoD 90 days to actually establish all these procedures. So far, it's taken about 3 years. That eventually gave rise to the DFARS clause, and we'll talk a little more about that later too. Some of the events since then, there have been literally probably hundreds of breaches we don't know about, and a few very high-profile ones that we have seen. OPM has been breached not one, not two, but 3 times, involving literally millions of records. The high-profile contractor breaches were the ones at USIS, 25,000 records, and really sensitive because those were records of personnel investigations for clearances. So we not only lost data to an unknown, probably foreign state actor, but we lost sensitive information that had to do with the clearances of some of our government employees and military personnel. There was a breach at another company called Keypoint, 2 of them in fact, very similar data. And this obviously concerned everybody, and since then there have been, I won't read all of these to you, you can scan them over, and of course this slide deck will be available to you when the webinar is over. So I would encourage you to take a look at these things, some of the breaches that have occurred, and some of the actions that have been taken in response to these breaches. There's been sort of a rash of cyber-related legislation and promulgation of a bunch of different standards. There's FISMA, Federal Information Systems Modernization Act, that's legislation, obviously. HIPAA was legislation, that's all the way back in the mid-90s. Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, Financial Services Modernization, and that had to do with security in the financial services industry. And then the payment card industry has issued a standard, and I'll give a shout out to an acquaintance of mine, Molly Wilkinson, no relationship there, no relation, who works for the payment card industry organization that promulgates these standards. And they've just recently issued an update to those standards. FedRAMP, where most of us are familiar with it if we do anything in the cloud. Because if you do government business, if you store government data in the cloud, you have to store it in a cloud that's FedRAMP qualified, okay? Most of us don't handle government data. Some contracts require you to handle data that comes from the government, belongs to the government, and has to be protected. If that goes in the cloud, you have to use a FedRAMP supplier. But now, some of these new standards are going to require that anything that contains CUI, controlled unclassified information, if you put it in the cloud, you'll have to put it in a FedRAMP qualified cloud. Is the audio going out?
Seems to be.
Okay, I will project more. Cybersecurity Act of 2012 failed to get through the Senate. Not sure why. And then there was CISA, the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act, to encourage voluntary sharing between the private sector and the federal government. Now, we know about voluntary sharing. That doesn't work real well in our environment sometimes. And just in case you missed it, just in case you've been asleep for a week or two, this whole cybersecurity thing is not over. This is not something that we've now conquered and the clauses are going to take care of everything. This continues to be a major issue. On September 7th, one of the major credit reporting agencies in the United States, there are only three major ones, disclosed a data breach that compromised personally identifiable information for 143 million individuals. And of course, the bad part of this breach is not only did we lose information for these individuals, a lot of the individuals that were compromised don't know their information was there. So here's our first poll. Jessica?
We've just launched it.
Okay. So have you, your company, or someone you know ever been affected by a data breach? I can answer that personally. I have been affected by a data breach. My data was at Equifax. When I logged onto their website and queried it, it said, yes, your information has been compromised. That concerns me a little bit.
All right, we're going to close this poll and we'll take a look at some of the data.
So what did people tell us?
Well, Rich, we have about 68% say that they've personally been affected by the breach. 32% say that someone they know has been affected. Interestingly, only 4% have not been affected. 3% don't know anyone, and then 5% have that I don't know.
To that 5% at the bottom of the screen, I suggest you
do some research.
Check with Equifax
Yep.
and see if you've been breached there, because 143 million people is literally half the adults in the country. Let's talk about the basics. And I'm not going to do the heavy lifting on the technology. I'm going to leave that up to Telos and Rick Tracy to do. But I will talk about the differences between them. The FAR approach creates standards and has requirements for securing systems. The DFARS clause requirements are to secure data, and that's very different. And remember, again, the FAR clause's authority arises out of an executive order. The DFARS authority arises out of law. The DFARS clause has very specific requirements for incident reporting, and it has a very short time frame. I think it's 72 hours. It also has stringent flow down requirements, and these are unusual because the flow down requirement here says that this clause will be flowed down to lower tier subcontractors without alteration. So primes, the government is telling you literally, you can't change this clause, you can't tailor it. You can add additional requirements, but you can't do it by modifying this clause. You'll need to write a clause of your own if you want to impose some additional requirements. You'll need a supplemental clause because you have to flow this one down without alteration. And the DFARS clause, if there is a breach, gives DoD personnel the right to come in and look at your systems, including systems operated by your cloud provider, if the breach happened in the cloud. The FAR clause has no incident reporting requirement at all. It does require flow down, but it doesn't say anything about whether you can modify the clause or not. Still no incident reporting, and there's no provision in the FAR clause for the government to come in and investigate any incidents that occur. There's a little bit of difference in implementation. Also, the FAR requirements are effective when a contract's awarded that has a clause in it. The DFARS thing, you could see clauses today in DoD contracts, but they don't require compliance until December 31st of this year. But there is no, there's no phase-in. There is no compliance required today. On December 31st, 2017, you must be in full compliance. If you're not in compliance, you have to notify the Chief Information Officer at DoD, and it's right in the clause, that of anything that has not been implemented, and absent any notice that something hasn't been implemented. By the way, you can't just say, I'm not in compliance. You have to say, but I have an alternate proposed method of securing my data, and the DoD CIO will say whether that's adequate or not. And they have to do that prior to award if the award is after December 31st, 2017. Without any such notice, DoD will presume that contractors are meeting all the requirements. There was a change to the DFARS clause published in October of last year, and that cited an additional provision in the 2016 NDAA that provided liability protections when reporting cyber incidents. So if you report promptly, there is liability protection for the prime and for lower tier subcontractors who report a breach, as long as you've reported within the requirements of the clause. So have you seen either a FAR clause, cybersecurity clause, or the DFARS clause in any of your solicitations to date? Now, I'm going to go out on a limb. I'm going to look in my somewhat cloudy crystal ball and say, I bet you no one's seen one yet. If they have, it's probably a pretty small fraction. Are we ready to check the answers yet, Jessica?
We sure are. Take a look here.
Well, I was wrong. It happened once before. An awful lot of people, 46% of our respondents said yes, they have seen these clauses in a solicitation already. I hope it's the FAR clause. If it's the DoD clause, it means you've really got a formal deadline on 12/31 to be in compliance under that contract. What happens if you have a contract with it in it and you're not compliant on 12/31? The answer I'm going to give you is absolutely correct and completely useless. And the answer is I don't know. and I don't think anybody does. And now I'm going to turn it over to Rick Tracy at Telos for a somewhat deeper dive into the technical requirements of these clauses.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. I'm going to try to get you some time back here. Excuse me. Next slide, please. Yeah, I have a pretty simple way of looking at controlled unclassified information. This is the way at least I look at it. I sort of think of it as what we have regarded in the past as for official use only, but CUI has a lot of protection rules around it that Rich alluded to with the FARs and DFARs. So let's talk a little bit about, on the next slide, how we go about protecting that controlled unclassified information. Next slide, please. Yeah, so there's this NIST special publication, 800-171, that basically is the rule book, if you will, for protecting controlled unclassified information. And the compliance deadline, as Rich mentioned, is the end of this year. Next slide. So this is a phrase or a paragraph directly from the special publication. It's really intended just to stress the importance of controlled unclassified information and the need to protect it. And I think that the breach statistics that Rich presented a few minutes ago underscores the importance, helps underscore the importance of protecting controlled unclassified information. So in a nutshell, there's a process that's defined by the NIST 800-171. If you read the documents, there's a requirement to assess yourself against the 800-171 requirements, and you need to generate a reporting matrix. You need to determine which requirements you satisfy and which you don't. And in cases where you don't satisfy, there's a need to create a remediation plan. As Rich alluded to, there's specific breach reporting requirements, and there's specific emphasis on things like multi-factor authentication, which I think Unanet is specifically interested in talking about. Next slide, please. So here's an interesting slide that sort of summarizes the CUI requirements. They're split. There's 110 requirements split across 14 different categories. And you can see here I've identified access control as, I'll use access control as an example. There are 22 specific requirements associated with access control that get to the heart of things like limit access to unauthorized users, and then there's many detailed requirements that are associated with access control, like limiting things to privileged users and logon attempts and things of that nature. So if you think about it, there's 110 requirements split across 14 CUI categories that point to roughly 130 853 controls, only for additional detail about, if you don't understand what the requirement's getting at, the controls are there really to help you understand in more detail what the obligation is. So anyway, this is just intended to give you some idea of the extensiveness of the requirements that you need to assess yourself against. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the requirements point to controls, specifically 853 controls and 27001 ISO controls. The important thing here to remember is that this isn't a compliance controls compliance exercise. The focus really is on the CUI requirements, as I said, of which there are 110. Another interesting point that I'll make here is that if you are an organization that has invested in an ISO 27001 certification, that addresses up to 35% of the CUI requirement. Roughly 35 to 37 of the 110 CUI requirements can be met simply by having an ISO 27001 certification. So if you do have such a certification, for those organizations that do, you're well down the path of dealing with that. So when you look at 171, when I look at it anyway, it presents a high-level process for defining what your environment is, developing a matrix for reporting compliance with the requirements. I would suggest gathering any evidence that you have that already exists, ISO 27001 certification, self-assessments against 853, or if you've adopted the NIST cybersecurity framework, there's perhaps information within your organization that you can use to satisfy the CUI requirement. I think it's important to gather artifacts so that you can demonstrate that you meet these requirements rather than just say that you do. There's some evidence that you can present. And I guess the other major point here is it's not a once and done. This is a continuous process. You have to make sure that your status with regard to CUI compliance is maintained over time. Next slide, please. So here, the next two slides are really extractions from the 171 document itself, and I highlight some terms here that you'll see in subsequent slides that are meaningful to me based on the work that we've done here with other NIST frameworks. Terms like system security plan, the need to define your system boundary, plans of action. These, you'll see in a moment, these are terms that are meaningful. And on the next slide, you'll get a sense for the type of reports that the government might be looking for as evidence that you're in compliance with 171. Again, system security plans and plans of action. It's abbreviated, right? There's in other NIST frameworks, plans of action is augmented with a term and milestones, right? So plans of action and milestone is a fancy way of saying remediation plan, which is a very important point as it relates to this process. It's not just identifying where you're not compliant. It's recognizing that you're not and having a plan to correct whatever that deficiency is. And there's going to be a need to provide those plans of action. Next slide, please. So just for argument's sake, I put together a slide here that shows what a process might look like or a report might look like. And on the far left, you can see a column for the 110 CUI requirements. You probably organized them by the 14 categories. Moving to the right, there's a column that you might identify the ISO or 853 control that you're using to help satisfy the CUI requirement. In the language that I listed from in a few previous slides, the 871 language, you could see, if you go back, you could see references to implementation, which is basically a request for you to explain how you're meeting the requirement, not just stating the requirement. And so there's a column here that would provide you the ability to explain how you meet it, the validation method, whether it's inspection or automated testing, whether the result is met or not met. A column for artifacts, again, is the screenshots or policies or whatever you would have to help evidence the fact that you meet a particular requirement or control that helps you meet a requirement. And then again, we get to this terminology, program objective and milestones, POAM in the far right column. This is basically just having a plan for those things that you don't currently meet. Next slide, please. So what I described on the previous slide is a spreadsheet-based way of getting the job done, but there are purpose-built systems like Exacta 360 that engages templates to solve specific cyber risk and compliance processes like FedRAMP, like NIST CSF, and at the end of this month, a template for the 800-171 requirement. Next slide, please. And so, just very quickly, our purpose-built system for 800.171 is really centralized around 3 basic tasks. The requirement for you to document your system, for you to engage controls and to do the analysis, and then there's a task for documentation. And as we'll see in the next slide, or in subsequent slides, that there's ability to generate other documents as this process is likely to evolve and require different types of documents. So we can talk about that in subsequent slides. Next slide, please. One of the things that our automated process helps is to generate the plan based on how you defined your system. It helps you generate the test plan that's necessary for you to begin to evidence compliance with these CUI requirements. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, as an extension of this process, automatically as issues are identified or non-compliance issues are identified, the system helps you create these POAMs that are going to be important for providing to satisfying requests for information about CUI compliance. So POAMs is a part of what we offer with this template. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, I fully expect that this 171 requirement is going to evolve over time. The references to things like the system security plan and POAM, again, remediation plans, are the first things that are being required. We should probably expect that other NIST-specific documents like security assessment report and risk assessment report, it's possible that in the future, those are documents that will also be required as part of this process as it evolves. And if that's the case, we have embedded capabilities to help auto-generate those documents as well. Next slide, please. So I guess my recommendations is that there is a deadline, but I would say don't panic. There's ways to get this work done, whether it be through a spreadsheet or purpose-built system. I would expect that this process, as I mentioned, to evolve over time. And I think that by using the purpose-built system, you can help manage this process. As the process evolves, as requirements change, you can continue to build on your CUI compliance over time. My basic point, though, is, there's a lot of FUD in the market. It's important for people to take this requirement seriously. I think the importance is to demonstrate that you're doing everything you can to comply with the requirement and not have the appearance of being negligent. But fear, uncertainty, and doubt is not the way for us to advance the ball here. Focus on the requirement and don't panic. And I think that's my last slide. Yep.
And that brings us to our next poll. Might be the last one, I'm not sure. Do you believe your company will be compliant by the 12/31 deadline? And the answers are pretty easy: yes, no, and I don't know. And remember, this is just your belief. Based on what you know about what your company is doing, do you think you're going to get there by 12/31? Well, half of you said yes. A few, what's that percentage?
14%.
14% said no. And the rest of you said, I don't know. Don't know whether we'll get there or not. Now, all those technical things are what you have to do to be compliant. But there are some business aspects of these two clauses I'd like to talk to you about for a minute. And that's which contractors, which contracts, which subcontractors are going to be affected. What do these clauses consider COTS and not COTS, and why not COTS? What happens when things go really, really wrong? Okay, prime contractors are required to rapidly report cyber incidents. That's 72 hours. The reporting is done to a DoD website, okay? The link is here. This requires a DoD-approved medium assurance certificate to log into this site. Just as a somewhat amusing side note, as of last week, the security certificate for this site had expired. Subcontractors, remember primes, you're required to flow down the DFARS clause without alteration. And the DFARS clause says that the contractor is required to report incidents to this DoD website. Notice I stopped there. I've read probably a half a dozen documents in the last week from fairly reputable sources that said that the subcontractor is required to report to DoD and the prime. Not by the clause, they're not. The clause requires subcontractors to report to DoD. Prime contractors and higher tier subcontractors, I'm talking to you now, if you want your subcontractors to also report breaches to you when they report them to the government, you're going to have to write a supplemental clause to put in that subcontract to establish that requirement, because flowing down the DoD clause doesn't do that. There's nothing in that DoD DFARS clause that requires a sub to report to the prime, only to report it to DoD. So if you want your subs to report breaches to you at the same time they report them to DoD, write something to put into your subcontracts to do that, because the flow down doesn't do it automatically. Under the FAR clause, there's no incident reporting required. However, if I was operating under a non-DoD contract with that FAR clause in it, and my subs experienced a breach of a system they were maintaining under the contract, I would want to know. If that's the case for you, you're going to, again, have to write something to put into your subcontracts to require your subcontractor to notify you, because the FAR clause won't do that. Now, I will say the FAR clause does not say anything about alteration. It does require flow down, but if you wanted to, you could modify the FAR clause and flow it down with a modified requirement to report to prime or upper tier subcontractor when you have a breach. So this is going to affect prime and sub relationships. Probably not for the better. The relationship between primes and subs is already a little bit prickly in some cases. We'd like to think we're all team members with the same mission in mind, but the reality is subcontracts in the government accounting or government contracting world are commercial documents. Anything that's not illegal and is possible that both parties agree to can be put into the contract. And we're seeing some really odd things show up in contracts. For example, I was talking just a few weeks ago in preparation for another webinar like this that I'm doing in Colorado next week. And I was talking with the head of contracts responsible for all subcontract administration with one of the major government contractors. Probably shouldn't mention the name. I asked her, I said, what are you writing for your subcontracts? What are you putting in your subs? Well, she talked about the flow down. She talked specifically about a reporting requirement to report to them in addition to the government. And then she went a step further that frankly surprised me a lot. She said, and we're requiring a certification by the sub that they're compliant. Now, if you look at the DFARS clause, the DFARS clause says that by submitting an offer on a solicitation that contains that solicitation provision, the contractor represents that they're compliant. Now that's significant, but in the government contracting world, certification is one level of statement. A representation is significantly weaker. So by submitting an offer as a prime on a government solicitation that contains the DoD DFARS clause, you are representing that you are compliant as of December 31st, 2017. She said, we're putting a certification requirement. We're requiring our subs to certify to us that they are compliant with both the FAR and the DFARS clause. And we're putting a termination provision in if it turns out that was not the case. That one surprised me a lot. And I couldn't help myself. The old contracting officer in me just jumped right out, and I said, well, what if you were the subcontractor and your prime gave you that clause? Would you sign it? And she said, not in a million years, and kind of chuckled. But she does plan to flow it down to her subs. You need to read what's in your subs really carefully as this stuff starts to be implemented early next year, because I think we're going to see some of those kinds of subcontractor clauses showing up in contracts. Subcontractors are required to flow the clause down to lower tier subcontractors, and there's no endpoint. If you're a fourth tier subcontractor and the prime contract has this clause in it, your customer should be flowing that down to you. Now, is this a so-called Christian doctrine clause? Will this be read into the contract even if it's omitted? I think the answer is probably no. I don't see this as a Christian doctrine clause. Of course, that hasn't been litigated. That'll be an interesting one if it ever occurs, but I don't think so. And no one yet has extended the Christian doctrine down to subs because, again, those are commercial contracts. So we'll see what happens. But primes, you need to write something if you want anything other than what's in the DFARS clause. And don't forget to flow that DFARS clause down. So last poll. If you're a prime, have you written a flow down clause to go in your subcontract over and above just flowing down the DFARS clause as is? And again, the responses are, yeah, no, or I don't know.
All right, Rich, we're at 14% have said yes, 53% have said no, and 33% have said I don't know.
And that doesn't surprise me a lot. I suspect a lot of those I don't knows are simply because the individuals responding are not in the contracting organization. They wouldn't have any insight into whether a clause has been developed or not. I'm a little surprised, frankly, to see as many yeses as are there, because I don't think this has gotten a lot of socialization among the subcontract administration community. The PCOs and the prime shops that award subcontracts are really not tuned into this very heavily yet, but they really need to get there. This one was a little bit tongue-in-cheek, if you'll forgive me, but I had to talk about exemptions from these clauses because there just aren't any. They didn't exempt small businesses, they didn't exempt 8As or women-owned businesses. No one is exempt. The implementation instructions in the DFARS are crystal clear. This is to be flowed down in every contract, every DoD contract, unless it is for a standard commercial off-the-shelf item, not services, goods. So if DoD's buying a PC from Dell or HP, they can probably leave this clause out. They might not, but they could. Almost anything else, the clause has to be there. They just didn't provide any exemptions. Now, I'm going to introduce another concept before I even talk about this stuff that is going to shock some people. A few of you will be in denial. A few of you will shake your head and go, no, he's crazy. And that may be, but your accounting system probably contains CUI. When you look at what's in your accounting system, For example, let's say you were doing business with the Naval Sea Systems Command, with a particular program office at the Naval Sea Systems Command that manages the Trident submarine fleet. And your contract was for curricula maintenance. You maintain the curricula that the subs have on board when they sail to train sailors during the 6 months that they're underwater out there every year. And I can tell that from the contract number. I can tell from the amount of money spent how much work is being done. I can probably tell if the statement of work is in there, what curricula are being maintained, including maybe even the curricula themselves. Most of them are unclassified, but they're sensitive. I can tell from the delivery schedule exactly when the submarines are going to set sail and from what ports on what dates, probably for the next 2 or 3 years. Now that's a lot of disparate data points that if you have a view of that, and all that data could be in your accounting system, that constitutes CUI. That's one of the most heavily protected pieces of information in the Navy. I used to work in that world. So if your accounting system does contain CUI, then it needs to be included as you do your system assessment for all your systems. And one of the things that has to be done to secure a system that has CUI in it is what's called identity management and multi-factor authentication. There are lots of different ways to do that, but here's the thing. Ask yourself, does my accounting system contain CUI? If it does, and most of them will, what do I do about that? Well, you could implement multi-factor authentication and identity management. That would be the logical approach. You could, as one security expert here in the area has suggested, cleanse your accounting system of all government data that could constitute CUI. In other words, take out all the points of contacts, the names, the addresses, the phone numbers, the paying offices, the contract numbers. I think when you get through, you don't have a government contract accounting system anymore. You might as well just use a general ledger from anybody. If that information's in your system and you do need multi-factor, I know, as of today, I know of 2 government contractor accounting systems that support multi-factor authentication. One of them is Unanet. I'm not going to name the other one. The important point here is there are about 6 or 7, maybe 8, but I can count them with my fingers and have fingers left over. Accounting systems that are widely used by government contractors. Of all of those, only 2 plan to implement or support multi-factor authentication. We already support multi-factor. We're doing some additional enhancements to our multi-factor authentication support between now and the end of the year. The software authentication providers that you see on the screen, OneLogin, Duo, and Okta, are 3 of the most popular. We support all 3 of those. In addition, if your accounting system is maintained in the cloud, or any other system for that matter, you will need to obtain from your cloud provider a representation that the cloud is being maintained at least FedRAMP moderate security levels. We're in the process during this month and next of moving all of our cloud instances of Unanet into Amazon Web Services FedRAMP moderate compliant cloud. So we'll be able to provide you with that representation, whether it's us or another accounting system provider. If you're in the cloud, obtain that representation in writing from your cloud provider before 12/31, along with all the other things you have to do. If you have questions about the NIST standard, whether it's 171 or 800-53, 800-53 is the one that the standard for cloud providers. And that's not really something you have to do. That's something your cloud provider has to do, but in some cases, you need to understand what the requirements are in order to understand whether what your cloud provider is doing is compliant or not. If you have questions there, please contact Rick Tracy at Telos. There is his email and his phone number. If you have questions about Telos Exacta tool for the compliance measurement, please contact Benjamin Cronin at telos.com, and there's his phone number. And of course, you're always welcome to visit us at unanet.com. If you have any questions there are lots of help. There's lots of help available on the website. And I'm hoping that we have a few questions.
We have more than a few questions.
Well, swing them out there and we'll see whether Rick and I or I1 can handle those.
No problem, no problem. One of the first questions was, can you please provide some examples of CUI?
I suspect that question came in before I did my little spiel about some of the information that might be in an accounting system. What the government's concerned about is information which, if compromised, could form a picture that tells a bad actor, whether it's a foreign state or a hacker, independent hacker, something of value that compromises information the government would rather not have out there in the world. Rick, you want to add to that?
No, I think that you covered it at a high level. I think that the 171 special publication probably gives some examples. I can't be more specific that off the top of my head, but I think at a high level you addressed it, Rich.
What else do we have, Jessica?
We have another really good one, actually. It says, how is a cyber incident defined? How do you know that you've had a cyber incident?
Wow, that's a hard one. And I'm going to ask Rick, how do companies know they've had a cyber breach?
Right. Yeah. So sort of $1 million question. I mean, it really does boil down to how do you define incident, right? And I have my thoughts about what an incident is. It means that someone has an unauthorized user has gained access to your systems or data. For me, it's that simple, because at that point you don't know whether something's been compromised, something's been exfiltrated, but a breach is basically someone who's not supposed to be in your network or having access to your data. Means that you've identified the fact that someone has actually done that. And then you could argue, well, they were there, but they didn't do anything bad. And I think that's where you start to split the hairs, and you need to determine whether it's a reportable thing or not. But the real question is, if you see that someone's there, how do you know that they did an exfiltration? How do you prove a negative? So
yeah, how do you prove they didn't do anything while they were in there? Right. I've asked my IT friends, and I asked somebody just yesterday about the Equifax breach. I said they determined that 143 million records were compromised. How do they know? And she talked to me about footprints in the network, footprints in the data, being able to tell that data had been accessed, and in their case, able to establish that it was accessed from outside, from not within their network. And by that forensic sort of investigation, determined which records had been compromised and which records had not. And apparently it was entire devices, an entire disk or storage device that had been accessed, and all they could do was assume that everything on the storage device had been compromised. I'm just surprised it wasn't everything. You got another one?
I do. This is actually a good question. As a small business, how do you kind of set up a situation to actually meet these requirements? We have a couple people who've said that they've received quotes in the multiple tens of thousands of dollars. As a small company, how do they manage this?
That's a good question. I think if I were a small business, I would be looking to offload a significant part of this to a cloud provider and not trying to do it in my server room down the hall, because when the server's down the hall and the data's in your physical space, then you have to take responsibility for every aspect, every one of those 110, I think Rick said, controls. If I offload an application to a cloud provider, then I narrow down what I have to be concerned about to things like, am I giving the right people access? Am I controlling their access properly? Am I logging their access properly? Am I logging attempts to penetrate the system properly? And all of the rest of it I can offload to the cloud provider. I think it's really important to have an independent assessment of your system. Somebody like Telos to come in and go through their Exacta process and assess your system and give you some sort of assurance that what you've done is at least a good faith effort to comply with the standard. The consequences of not doing it, we don't know yet. But I can tell you, I had lunch with an old friend last week. He happens to be an attorney. And yes, they do sit down to meals like normal people sometimes. And he works in the protest world, okay, either helping companies do protest or defending against protests. And I said, what do you think this cyber business is going to do to the whole protest process? And he was literally drooling on the tablecloth. He said, I think that the #1 protest next year is going to be, hey, I'm cyber compliant. That guy you awarded to is not. And I think in that situation, it would be awfully important to be able to trot out an assessment report of some kind and say to a GAO investigator, yes, I am. I had somebody look at my system and we've made the effort. We've done what we think we're required to do. I think that'll be a whole lot stronger position than saying, well, we worried about it a lot.
We have one more question. Do we have, we probably have another minute or so. Would you guys like to take one more?
Sure.
This question is if we do not prime DoD contract, are we exempt?
Oh, and the answer is absolutely not. If you're a subcontractor on a DoD contract, flow down is required. If your prime doesn't put it in there, the prime is definitely remiss. They're going to take the shot. But, you know, no, you don't dodge the bullet by being a subcontractor.
Great.
Thank you very much, everyone. I hope you've gotten a little something out of it. And the slides will be available.
The slides will be available, and we'll make some tweaks to the recording for you guys, and we'll get that out as soon as possible.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.